Good evening and welcome to our second King's Talk of this academic year. My name is Greg Hunter and I'm the Deputy Head Co-Curricular at King's. Tonight we'll be hearing from Paddy Loughman about his life since leaving King's in 2004 and the importance of tackling climate change. Paddy is an independent strategist and speaker. He spent the last decade working as a business and communications consultant across a wide range of sectors, most recently as a strategy director at Wolff Olins. He is now taking various steps to encourage action on the climate and ecological emergency, focused in particular on the role business and culture can play in transforming our prospects. The title of the talk is Facing Change, Can We Grasp the Promise in the Peril? And the format is that Paddy will provide an initial presentation of about 30 minutes, after which we'll be taking questions from the audience. Please either type your question into the Q&A function as part of Zoom at any time, or alternatively, put up your virtual hand after the presentation and I can put you live on the air to ask the question yourself of Paddy. Now, it is with great pleasure that I pass you over to our guest, Paddy Loughman. Paddy.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, everyone. Hello, thanks for having me. It is a real honour to be here talking to you. Also, I hear that we're live casting in the Galpins Common Room, which is a particular honour, having been a former Galpinite. I'm going to talk to you about climate change today, as Greg says, and I'm going to start sharing my screen now to do that. We'll aim for 30 minutes and then I look forward to having some chat with you afterwards. So can everyone see that? It looks like we can. Great. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about the climate and ecological emergency, what it means for us and what we can do about it. I give a talk like this to all sorts of audiences, especially business leaders, at places like Google and British Gas. And given that you are, those of you who are students, some of the most educated young people alive, I'm going to speak to you pretty much how I would speak to them. So I speak to those people primarily as a business strategist. What I mean by that is someone who is professionally analytical, critical, skeptical, and concerned about improving our prospects. I've spent over a decade working as a consultant for some of the world's biggest and most impactful organizations across research, innovation, growth, and brand. Some of the kind of jobs that you discover exist when you finally get out in the world. While I was working at Wolff Olins most recently, we talked about being ambitious for our clients and optimistic for the world. Today, I work with various groups across political campaigning, activism, business strategy, economic system change, communications, from the UN to Extinction Rebellion. I still carry that Wolff Olins optimism. I am stubbornly optimistic and radically hopeful. I like to think of that hope as the courage to embrace radical uncertainty and still keep moving forward, as Rebecca Solnit puts it. So being hopeful means having the courage to make a choice about what kind of change we want here. Climate change or system change. And when we realize how perilous this climate change is and how much promise there is in a system change for things to be better quickly, and that we can do this and that it's an easy choice to make, it then becomes an easy choice to make. And to have this hope, to courageously make this choice, we need to face this change. As James Baldwin says, not everything that is faced can be changed. Millions of lives have already been lost or damaged. But until we face the change that is coming and the change we need to make to avoid it, it will keep getting worse. It will take effort now and some loss. Change always does, but the gains will be worth it. Because when we do this, when we choose system change, a better world awaits for all of us. So you might think that talking about climate during the COVID-19 pandemic is kind of getting our priorities wrong. I mean, it is the most transformational event to happen in living history, perhaps the last 500 years, someone was saying recently. But as you'll see, this is all part of the same thing, the same system. And this is a crucial moment for it, a turning point. We need to face the change that is coming, that big wave at the back there, or it will overwhelm us. And so far, that's not what we've been doing. We have been in denial We've been playing golf while our house was catching fire. But today that fire is becoming harder to ignore. So we're going to talk about the peril first and then the promise. The peril is described by the science, which is conservative. What I'm about to say is not extreme, it's very much mainstream, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. Hopefully you are. If you find yourself denying that science at any moment, ask yourself, why are you feeling that? Denial is a defensive position. So what are you defending? It's possible you'll be defending your ideal world, your expectation of what your life will be, your story. So let's begin by imagining that, your ideal world, your ideal story. What's happening there? What matters to you in it? Who is in it? You're probably not thinking about the entire planet when you're doing that, are you? Which is okay, because the first crucial thing to realize in all of this is that this is not about saving the planet. This is typically, or has typically been, the message from environmentalists. We're destroying the planet, so we need to save it for the sake of all the animals and the trees, etc. But the reality is that we don't really care about that, or at least not enough, not much. I don't think I really do, not really about the whole planet. I care about my wife, my family, my friends, but the whole planet? So do we stop there then? Is that it? We go home? No, sadly, because whilst the planet doesn't need saving necessarily, we do. Because this planet that we're destroying provides all of the food, water, and air that we need to survive. It is our life support system. So by heating it up with emissions and destroying the wildlife, as we'll go on to talk about, we are destroying that life support system. And it's the only one we've got. Mars is a desert. The nearest Goldilocks planet, i.e. somewhere a bit like Earth, is light years away, and you'd weigh 75 tons on the surface. There is no other planet for us. This is the one we have. So this whole conversation we're going to have is about us. It's about you, it's about me, it's about your families, your friends, your communities. So how are we destroying our life support system? Fundamentally by doing two things, which again, you're probably quite familiar with by now, I hope so anyway. We're heating up the planet with emissions, and we're destroying nature. The emissions bit we've done very recently, and this is greenhouse gases, predominantly carbon, being put into the atmosphere, which creates kind of like a big blanket around the Earth. And we've done this within a generation, really. So 85% of the carbon that's been put in the atmosphere, creating that blanket, was put there since World War II. And 50% since the first episode of The Simpsons aired in 1989, when I was 3. This is part of the great acceleration. You might have heard of that. And the thing is about this is that we've done this knowingly. People made a choice. They have designed a system that has led to this. When I say a system, I really just mean a set of choices and decisions, designs that people make and maintain every day. Our current system, or set of systems really, are causing this temperature rise. You're probably familiar with these numbers that are going to appear on the screen now. The leading panel on climate science says that we need to try and keep to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, the pre-industrial temperature. Where we are right now is we're at 1.1. And where we're heading is 4 degrees currently, 3 to 4 degrees. The problem with these numbers is they're a bit abstract, and actually maybe they sound kind of nice. Maybe it means, playing rugby or hockey in the winter without losing a toe to frostbite. But these are small numbers and they have big impacts. So the gap between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, if we were to go that way, if we were to get to 2 degrees, means that the death of 150 million people, that is something like 11 Holocausts, cost of $20 trillion and 3 times the level of destruction compared to 1.5 degrees. The other factor here is that these sound like that's the temperature increase. So it's going to be 23.5 degrees instead of 21 or whatever. And the reality is that actually that's a global average. So over land, it's quite different. And it can be as much as 10 degrees increase. So we had a heat wave in London last year at 39 degrees, and there were fights at the outdoor swimming pools. That was 39 degrees, and that was for a day. When you get into 2 degrees territory, you're talking about maybe 40 degrees, 45 degrees, and lasting much longer than that. It's already 10 to 20 degrees warmer in the Arctic. And even COVID hasn't sufficiently halted the increase of these temperatures. So we need to really address this quickly, because what's happening is that as these temperatures rise, we leave our safe zone. Attenborough recently described it as our Garden of Eden. That 10,000 years of relative flatness that you can see on the bottom right there, that's got Holocene written above it, that's us existing, that's us developing agriculture and thriving into where we are now. And we're leaving that little nice flat territory and going into these higher temperatures that we haven't seen on the planet for a very long time, millions of years even. In fact, the last time it was 4 degrees, there were alligators in the Arctic. So we simply don't know if we can survive that. It's not about new normal. This is about never normal again. And the uncertainty of that is very, very difficult for us to manage. So the other thing we're doing is we're destroying wildlife, and it's happening really fast. So we are causing animals to go extinct at a rate that's 1,000 times faster than normal. And the rate for plants is 500 times faster. This puts us in the 6th mass extinction. You might have heard of this. These are events that have happened throughout history, and typically 75% to 90% of all life on the planet goes in these events. And we're heading into one of those right now. Part of the problem is that we're using 100 billion tons of resources every year, which is 80% over the sustainable limit. So that's like needing 5 Earths to live the way we're living. And we've only got one, as we said before. The wildlife, the natural world, nature or biodiversity is really important for us. We need it. It is our life support system. It provides us with stability, fundamentally. So this isn't about koalas and polar bears, although it is sad that they're dying. Without wildlife, we can't live. As a small example in this, we get 50 to 85% of our oxygen from the phytoplankton in the oceans that we are currently acidifying and filling with plastic. So that is our oxygen tank being destroyed. What we're doing here is we are sawing off the branch that we are sitting on. And the thing here is that the heating is bad, right? If we get to 4 degrees, that is a seriously bad scenario. We can't all survive that. Some people will. Some people will have some kind of life up in the Northern Hemisphere somewhere. But this loss of nature is the much, much worse threat. Because if we lose biodiversity, then none of us can survive. And fundamentally, that's because we are nature. So if we lose it, then we lose us. And any bunkers that people might be building, thinking that they might be lifeboats, are not lifeboats in this scenario. They are just first-class cabins. If the ship goes down, we all go down with it. So really, there's another wave in this picture. It's a threat that we have struggled to acknowledge. And one of the main reasons for that is that in fact, the main reason for that is that we tell ourselves a story about being separate from nature. We've kind of treated nature like it's a bit of a slave. It's something that we can own and endlessly exploit for the sake of our own desires. Coronavirus reveals the flaw with this. We are not separate from nature or each other. We exist with it and each other, intimately intermingled. Science is proving this constantly, whether it's quantum physics or systems biology, and COVID-19 has revealed it. We are interconnected. When we tell ourselves that nature is a commodity, we end up destroying it. And a great example of this with COVID is that we pack these animals tightly together in cages. This is where the virus emerged from, as a direct result of laws in China that encourage people to treat animals as products and sell them accordingly. If we keep nature locked down in cages, we spawn viruses that mean we get locked down as well. And here's a startling fact in this sort of consideration here. Just 43% of our bodies are human cells. In fact, the only time that we are more human, and this is because of the biome in our body. So there are bacteria and other organisms in our body and on our skin. The only time we go above 50% human cells is when we go to the loo and do a poo. Otherwise, we are less than half human cells. So we are nature. What this means really is that nature is our community, not our commodity. We share 1/4 of our genes with trees. These things are our relatives. As crazy as that might sound, it is actually our reality. So what have we been doing about this heating and destruction of nature, of biodiversity? Basically not enough. Utterly inadequate efforts, as the Secretary General of the UN says. That line going up there is the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, creating that blanket. And over the 30 years that we've had these big conversations, big talks, it's kept going up. And why is that? Well, one of the main reasons is that this thing we're talking about here, climate change, climate crisis, global warming, has been a story, just a story, an issue, told only by a few, mentioned less often in 2017 in the UK media than picnics. We haven't been able to see the fire on the mountain behind us because we have not been presented with reality. So what we need to recognize here is that it isn't a story, it is the setting within which all stories now take place. And part of the challenge in recognizing that is that waking up to this is hard to do. The lack of coverage is part of the problem, but we're also not psychologically evolved very well to respond to threats like this, or certainly how they have been in the past. When they are invisible, delayed, gradual, and distant, we struggle to acknowledge them. We have various psychological biases that we can look at as barriers or issues in this situation. One of the first is status quo bias. We just find it easier to keep things the same because it means we expend less energy than having to change things. So this is difficult when we are being told we have to change, like I'm doing right now. We have the consumer fantasy. We've been trained by our iPhones and the other things around us with the idea that someone somewhere else will fix it for me for free. There will be no app update for the climate crisis, I'm afraid. That would be nice, but it won't come. We have optimism bias, the idea that it probably won't happen to me. It's going to happen somewhere else to someone else. And we have the hyperbolic discounting problem, where we don't think about things far away as being as valuable as things immediately to us. So the idea of doing things now for the sake of something later is hard. If you've ever bought biscuits at the beginning of the week and wanting to have some on the weekend and ended up eating them during the week and being then sad that you don't have any on the weekend, you'll know what I'm talking about. The illusory truth effect is a real challenge in all of this. Repeated lies, half-truths, misinformation become beliefs for people. If someone is told something repeatedly, even if it's not true, it starts to become true. And we have the backfire effect. People who are really strongly believing something don't respond well to facts that tell them that they're wrong. In fact, they even believe the thing that they believe, which is wrong, more strongly if you give them facts that tell them that they're wrong. And this is information that the deniers who are currently in power in our world, Putin, Trump, Bolsonaro, Murdoch, understand, and they understand well. And this denial has shifted over time. They can't pretend it's not happening anymore, although some still do try to do that. So they're saying it isn't so bad, that fixing it is too expensive. These kind of tactics are also denial. Remember how denial is defensive? They are essentially defending their power. They are invested in you not knowing what is going on here and not acting it, because to them, their power is more important than your future. And that is an unfortunate reality, and it's a difficult one that we have to work through. So a lot of people are not recognizing this seismic shift from story to setting and seeing what is happening in the world around them. And this denial is often presented in very credible, by credible seeming sources like this MIT scientist, Richard Lindzen, who it turns out is funded by the largest coal company in the US. Fake or misleading information spreads 6 times faster than normal news, and often because it has been crafted to be what we want to believe. And we would love to believe that this isn't happening. And I'm afraid that it is. We also get stuck in these media wraparound effects where we keep just hearing the same thing and it's hard for new information to come in. All of this we've just discussed makes it very hard for us to face the change. So what does all this mean? What does all the stuff that's going on, the heating and the destruction of the biodiversity mean? We're going to take a quick look at your lifetime. And I'm talking to the students here. So here you are. Hopefully, what I'm going to go through here is unlikely. Hopefully, this is the year when we will commit to sufficient action. But it's not yet certain. So it might be that if we don't commit to sufficient action in 2020, when we're at 1.1 degrees, then by 2050, we will have reached 2 degrees. That 150 million people will have died from pollution alone in that process. And we have these other factors. So you're maybe in your 40s. You're maybe sending your own children to King's at this point. We have heat waves at a level that we have never experienced before and that are simply intolerable. In 2010, a Russian heat wave killed more people than during a 10-year conflict with Afghanistan. But in 2050, at 2 degrees, these heat waves will be 32 times more extreme and last 5 times as long. 2 degrees is talked about as the uninsurable number. And other places in the world refer to it as genocide because they will see their entire nation disappear off the map. Over half the world's population will be lacking resources at this point. And the key thing here is people being displaced by heating in parts of the world where they can no longer live because it's too hot or because there are resource problems. And the high end of that figure of number of people is 1 billion people, which is the population of North and South America combined, or the entire population of the planet during the Industrial Revolution. That's 41 people being displaced per minute. If you remember the migrant crisis here, that was caused by 1 million people. And to put those numbers into context, because these are big numbers and our brains don't feel them very well, 1,000 seconds is 16 minutes, 1 million seconds is 11 days, 1 billion seconds is 30 years. So the difference between 1 million and 1 billion is 11 days and 30 years. We're talking about 1 billion people needing a new home and never being able to return home ever again. So if we think a COVID lockdown is bad, it will be nothing compared to a climate lockdown at 2 degrees. And the thing is, this is often about worrying about the young people. The young people can run faster. We should be worrying about the older people. So we're going to skip ahead again now to 2100, 2100, 4 degrees we've reached at this point. You're in your 90s probably. And this is a scenario we do not want to reach. Will we go extinct here? Probably not. There'll be some people still alive. Hopefully this will be unlikely, but the government is making preparations for this possible outcome. It's not the worst case scenario. It could be worse than this. It's seeming more and more unlikely that it would be, but that is still not the worst case scenario. But it is apocalyptic as far as we're concerned. You've got damage costing 2 times the wealth we currently have in the world. Much of the life on the earth is gone. Uninhabitable countries where it's simply too hot to go outside. Resources for, at this point, less than 4 billion people. Will have 11 billion people on the planet at this point. Global peace, obviously, as a result, is pretty impossible. And essentially, society as we understand it collapses. We cannot live in the way we currently do at that point. But do I care? Do I personally care about that? I'm not going to be around then. Many of us on this call won't be around then. Difficult, right? Except that it's happening now, this stuff. It's not 2100 that we really need to be worrying about. It's today. Flooding, not just fires in the US, in Australia, sorry. Apocalyptic scenes in California. You may have heard of the concept of climate justice. This is the attempt to tackle the fact that those who've done the least damage will suffer the most and vice versa. That's what we're seeing at the moment around the world. Mary Robinson, who was the president of Ireland, said that achieving climate justice is equivalent to the space race for this generation. What a rallying cry. But then again, this stuff isn't happening here, is it? Like not, you know, this stuff, right? Except it is here, and it's here, and it's now. Pollution currently in this country kills more people than smoking and costs the US 20 billion pounds. It kills globally 4 million people a year, more than malaria, violence, HIV, AIDS, alcohol, and drugs combined. Men in particular lose mental faculties as they age as a result of pollution, equivalent to a 20% gap in test scores. That's like getting C's instead of A's at A-levels. We've had a village in Wales decommissioned because of sea level rise. Vegetable yields are down by 50%. So how does this make you feel? How does this make you feel about that ideal world we were thinking about earlier? What starts to come to mind about that? A lot of feelings, maybe. So now what? This is, without a doubt, the greatest challenge that we have yet faced as a species. It is much, much bigger than coronavirus, which, as I said, is essentially a symptom of all of this. Surviving this challenge is a real case of understanding this point. We have to find the resilience, the cooperation, and the courage to work through this together. We have misread Darwin. Fittest means the most able to cooperate, not those with brute strength. But we know how to do that. We need to change the system, the systems that we live with, and it is going to require major transformation. Ultimately, underneath all of the sort of challenges here is the economic model, by which I mean the set of systems that we've designed to organize ourselves and the resources that support us. And this quote here, the way our economic and political systems must change, work must change or they will perish. We need a dynamic capitalist economy that gives everyone a justified belief that they can share in the benefits. It's not some sort of radical lefty position. That is the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times. This language of reset at the moment is everywhere, and people really realizing what we need to do in this moment. Economics comes from the ancient Greek meaning household management. We're not doing so well with the household management. And part of the reason for that is because we built an economy that depends on fossil fuels, which are responsible for the emissions that are heating up the planet. And we've been using those fossil fuels a bit like a credit card. It's easy to think of a credit card as cheap money, something to pay back later. You can do a lot with cheap money. Same deal with fossil fuels. They've allowed us to do amazing, wonderful things. A single barrel of oil, which is about 3 tanks of your average car, is the same power as the work of your average human in 12 years. And we use 97 million barrels of oil a day. But we've been ignoring the debt, the credit card debt, the carbon in the atmosphere, the damage to nature, which has been building up, and now we have to pay it. And it's a big debt because it turns out that fossil fuels weren't cheap after all. We just hadn't accounted for the cost of the damage to nature that they create and the damage to us and our health. We have been ignoring or vastly undervaluing that cost. We tend to call it an externality. Imagine calling your credit card bill an externality. So we've racked up this big bill, carbon emissions and damage to nature, borrowing from your future, from the future of your children. And of course, we can't use the card to pay off the bill. So we need something else. Economics is essentially a question of design. It can be designed, it can be reprogrammed. Systems are just people making choices every day. We can change them if we change those choices. If we choose a donut instead of the fossil credit card, there's just one of the ideas out there, and it's a brilliant one that is being suggested as the way to move this system forward, how to redesign it. This book is brilliant. It dispels so many of the myths that we carry around about our economy and seeks to design an economy in service to life, ensuring we meet the needs of all within the means of the planet, rather than one which means we need 5 planets. And it avoids us going into that destructive debt. It means 2 things. It means recognizing that we are not apart from nature. As we saw with those cells in the body earlier, we are a part of nature and we rely on it. So we have to look after it, to look after ourselves, which means distributing the wealth and energy better, prioritizing health and well-being, regenerating our biodiversity. And it feels better when we realize this. 60% of people in lockdown realize the value of nature for their health, and they feel better as a result. The second thing is that we need to tackle the inequality in the world. Right now, if you pile up everyone's wealth, most of the world, it's in $100 bills, right? Most of the world are sat on the floor, just flat on the floor. Us in this conversation, probably about the height of a chair, maybe the table. The billionaires, those people like Jeff Bezos, are in outer space. That gap is a problem. And that gap has got bigger during COVID. Bezos' 150 billion fortune, or whatever it was before, has increased by 65% during the coronavirus. And this is not about bashing billionaires. High inequality is a design failure. We need to tax them better. It cannot make sense for 8 men to own as much as half of the world. And this is not an ideological position, this is a pragmatic one. In an unequal society at this level, we cannot make decisions effectively. We cannot face the change. Good news is that we really do know what to do about this. In times of crisis, seemingly impossible ideas suddenly become possible. Now is the time to do this. We've seen this with COVID, haven't we? And we now know from COVID that it is much better to prevent than to cure, which we can do because we have all the solutions we need. This is the Drawdown project, which is drawdown meaning bringing carbon out of the atmosphere. They suggest that now is better than new. We don't even need to do masses of innovation. We have all the stuff we need right now to go ahead and fix this. And a lot of this stuff is already happening. As this film 2040 shows, everywhere you look, you will see incredible reasons for hope. It's stuff that's out there, just needs to be scaled. And it's happening locally. In the UK, we've got Rewilding at Neper State. This is what Attenborough says in his documentary, which I suggest you watch, and I think we have a slide on it. We need to rewild the world because rewilding brings down carbon out of the atmosphere much more effectively than many other measures. But there are new jobs all over the world. Things like solar grids, solar microgrids in Tanzania, transforming the way that energy works. And that's a massive thing, of course. Clean energy is going to be a massive thing moving forward. This is how many solar panels we would need to power the entire Earth permanently. That little square there. A major shift is underway as we recognize that we live in a world of abundance and not scarcity. And there are problems with solar panels. Absolutely there are. But I would suggest they're not as big as the problems we have with the other things we currently use. And if we can do these things that we know how to do, we will lead a healthier, cleaner, safer, more fulfilling life, imbued with more meaning. So what do I say to businesses? I'm just going to do this quickly. Basically, I say that sustainability is an opportunity. We tend to think of it as something they have to catch up to, something they're behind on, something that's a sacrifice they have to make. And businesses are recognizing this and putting it right at the heart of their business models. And it's very exciting. It's been an agenda, as I say, a bit like an issue, the story on the side. It's now at the heart and center of what they're doing. And if you're wondering about China and what they're up to, this is about an opportunity. It's not about having to make a sacrifice that China is not going to make as well. If we want to, there's opportunity here. And there's a lot of it. 7 times returns on the investment that we can make. And that's the point here. It's not about cost. It's about investment. There's a $10 trillion opportunity from investing in nature available every year until 2030. That's the German, UK, and Indian economies combined. And it brings with it 380 million new jobs. This is about competitive advantage. So what do businesses need to do about this, and what are they already doing? Committing to zero carbon, making a plan to do that forever. Because if you're not planning to do it forever, then it's not sustainable. Carbon zero is an investment, and getting rid of the concept of waste, the idea that we have waste. There is no way to throw this stuff to. Waste is simply a resource in the wrong place. If we can think like that, it can be extremely powerful. And investing in nature. And businesses joining up all sorts of things like this. There's masses of stuff going on across the advertising industry, various other places. And it's centering around an understanding of something really important, which is that we have had this idea that we need to, as I was saying earlier about the hyperbolic discounting, we have to make things different now to avoid an apocalypse. And so that might mean making sacrifices now to avoid something worse later. But people can't imagine the worst later. And doing something worse now for the sake of something they can't imagine later is really, really difficult. But that's okay, because it's not about better than the apocalypse. It's about better than today. Because as Christiana Figueres, the architect of the Paris Agreement, said, most, if not all, measures to address climate change actually bring a better quality of life. That's what this is about. It's about getting to a better life now by doing the things that we know how to do and that we can do. But this is all expensive, isn't it? Right? This is the common refrain. It's too expensive, we can't afford it. This graph I encourage you to look at online is called the trillions graph from Information is Beautiful. It's an overview of all the money in the world, basically. Remembering that a billion is 30 years, a trillion is 30,000 years. So it's lots of money. This is a little thing to zoom in on here. 53 trillion is how much it would cost to completely reverse this. And down in that tiny corner there is the 1.2 trillion it would need in the EU. And that is set against the wealth of the 1%. You need 1.2 million euros to be in that group. I expect there's many of us on the call that fall into that. The top 10% own 84% of the world's wealth, by the way, and you only need 240,000 to sit at that table. So that's a pretty interesting picture, but I think even more interesting is this. 26.5 trillion, more than half of what's needed to do that, is currently sitting down the back of sofas of the world's wealthiest, hidden away in a place that they can access but no one else can see. That's absurd. And I think if we really lean into that and recognize that and try and face into that, then we can find the money we need. So when people say we can't afford this, ask them who they mean by we. What can you do? There's a lot you can do, of course, but I think 3 things are really important here. Talk about this all the time, speak up about it. It's the setting now. What are your parents doing about it? Show up. What are your politicians doing? Where is your money? How are you investing? Where's your parents' pensions? Vote with your feet, your clicks, and your wallet. So many people cannot make better choices, but you can where you are. Act up. See something that's not right? What are you going to do about it? Be the change that you want to see. And don't underestimate the power of the movements like the Youth Strike for Climate, who I did a bit of work with, fantastic group of people. You are the future customers, voters, employees, and investors. People pay attention to you. And there is some urgency here. We have to reduce our emissions by 50% in 10 years. So this is your future, your family's future. It's critical that you keep finding out about this stuff. Speak up, show up, act up. Check out TED Countdown. There's a lot of information in there. It's coming out over the next few weeks. Watch dear old David's latest film. It's beautiful. A lot of the things I've said are echoed in it. Some podcasts to have a listen to if you're wanting to hear about these answers and how people are pursuing them. And recognize this. It's easy to feel like we can't do anything as individuals, but individually we are a drop. Together, we are an ocean. Perhaps the best thing you can do is remember that we aren't alone in this. We are interconnected with each other and nature. And when we realize that and work together, then amazing things can happen. So just a quick summary. That place you imagined at the beginning is not lost. But if we don't do enough, then by 2050, we have 2 degrees and that nearly 1 billion people displaced. And if we reach 4 degrees by 2100, we are looking at the end of what we know to be society. Nature is our community. We are nature. Sustainability is an investment opportunity. And this is the setting for all stories. Stories about designing a healthier economy. Speak up about this, show up and act on it. Dinosaurs couldn't see the asteroid. We can, because we are the asteroid. And there's a story here that we'll be the only species to ever anticipate its own extinction and still go extinct. A better story would be that we'll be the only species to ever anticipate its own extinction and avoid it. That's a story I want to be part of. That story is my ideal world. So let's choose to be the hope, to have the courage, to choose system change over climate change, to grasp that we can do this. We can do the system change. We can live in all the promise of those worlds we imagined at the beginning. In fact, we're already doing it. And that's not an extreme view. It's simply a basic statement of fact. But it does take facing the change. So thank you and good luck. And I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Paddy. That's an amazing presentation and talk, and I'm sure we have a lot of questions in a moment. I'm going to pinch the first question, and I apologise now for it being so less relevant, I suppose, as somebody's already asked a question here, and that is sort of, I suppose, tell me about how you moved from King's to the position you are in now, and one of the questions already coming through is how did you reach your job in terms of qualifications at Wolff Olins?
Yeah, it's been a strange story actually, and my journey is fairly unusual. First thing to note is that I grew up in an oil family. My dad was a senior leader in Shell, and in fact he and I now work together on some things. So it was always with me, this reality from the inside and from a very particular perspective, which is an understanding of that system, which is very complicated and something that many people have misconceptions about. But King's for me was an amazing place. I didn't take full advantage of it, and I think regret some of that. I was too concerned with skateboarding and beatboxing when I was there. Fortunately, at a time when YouTube didn't exist, there's no evidence of that anyway. But yeah, I regret not taking advantage of the amazing things on offer at King's as much as I could have done. And I think the rest of my time following it was an attempt to sort of make good on that. So I went to university, studied English, decided to go and become an actor. I'd won some awards doing acting and wanted to try and do that. So I trained to do that. And then whilst I was doing that, I looked for a plan B, and that rapidly became the world of communications and innovation, partly because I had this climate thing in the back of my mind. And it felt to me like this was a communications challenge fundamentally, because even then you could sort of see that we kind of knew what to do, but we were lacking the will to do it. People weren't doing it. And there's a quote from Andrew Breitbart, which is that politics sits downstream from culture. So people weren't voting for this because the culture wasn't sort of suggesting that they should. So that for me was then about communication. So I found my way into a very young company, Bow and Arrow, which is focused on innovation and growth, in fact. And through that, became very interested in particular in the world of brand. Brand basically being the process of thinking about what story are you putting in the world and how do you sort of try and shape that in people's heads. And became very interested in behavioral science, ancient rhetoric, which is sort of ancient behavioral science, and all sorts of other bits that kind of melded into that. And then found my way to Wolff Olins, which was an extraordinary experience with some really, really brilliant people. But basically by the end of my time there, so 3.5 years, 4 years, I was itching to do more on this and realized that I could probably do more outside than I could inside, which is so far proving to be true. I'm doing lots of really interesting things, and I don't think I'd be able to do them if I was still in a company full time. I hope that sort of answers some of the questions, what was behind the question about my route to Wolff Olins.
Thank you. Okay, so just a reminder, please, and I'm more than happy as the questions start coming through. I'm really keen, if somebody wants to ask a question live on the air, by all means, put your virtual hand up through Zoom, and I will. I'll put you on to ask. I'll let you ask Paddy yourself. So the first question is: can climate change really be tackled with a capitalist economy based upon businesses trying to produce as cheap as cost as possible? Hence, so many fossil fuels and profit-seeking production. How do we get out of that?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it's a very live one at the moment. I think fundamentally one of the first things that needs to happen in this situation is we need a very serious carbon tax. And some people I work with, who are very sort of in the weeds on this stuff, suggest that if we can get that, it sort of corrects the system, at least in the immediate sense. But getting to that is challenging, and it's proven to be challenging in the past. And carbon credits and things like that haven't quite worked. But fundamentally, if we can get a tax right, one that is sort of ring fenced to nations and that creates a sort of social wealth dividend, so that you don't end up with gilets jaunes problems where people on the ground suffer the most, then that starts to correct the system. Capitalism is not an evil thing. Capitalism is a machine, a tool. It's a bit like fire. It does what it does really well, but if you don't look after it, then it goes a bit haywire. So we need to look after it better. We need better regulation on it, and that is a fairly sort of common view, I think, these days. So it's a very important question. We do need to reduce the amount of stuff that we buy and do, but there are then various perspectives on whether we can decouple what we do fully from the amount of emissions that creates and the demand on resources that creates, and whether actually we just need to reduce the stuff we buy. And it sort of sits somewhere in between those two things, I think. But yeah, the language of resetting capitalism is very popular at the moment. And it doesn't mean destroying capitalism. Capitalism's doing that to itself. It means trying to give it better steer to help it do what it can do best.
Okay, thank you. And next question, what can individuals do? So, I mean, we've talked there, I suppose, as that capitalist economy. What can individuals do now in their lives to help tackle that climate change and the biodiversity destruction? Yeah,
again, it's such an important question, and there's a lot of guidance on this. I mean, at the back of the book that I pointed in there to The Future We Choose, there's a really good structure of do this today, do this month, do this year. I really recommend getting and reading that. And there are, of course, all these sort of little consumer level things that you can do in terms of like eating less meat. I'm not suggesting become a vegan overnight, but we need to eat less meat. So maybe just try 1 day a week less, buying less stuff. I think it's sort of about trying to think about, what do you really need and what do you really want, and making a call on that. And then I really do think that the most important thing is talking about this, voting for this, like being out there, changing that story in the world that helps us understand what's going on here, and making this something that people are really aware of all the time. And that then starts to cause us to act. But I think that the key thing is not to feel the onus as an individual to sort of bear the responsibility of this. And also therefore not to feel like, well, I've done my recycling, so I've done my bit, because it's more than that. And the more is us together. So finding ways to be together with people on this is probably a crucial thing to do.
Excellent, thank you. And I suppose looking at our political system, our current democracy of first past the post in this country, does it allow climate change to be tackled as quickly as it needs to be? I come from Australia, where there's a very different political system actually in the first past the post, and in the upper house there's actually a level of proportional representation which does enable some aspects of that. So I'm not sure if that's potentially part of the answer, but is it too late with our current political system?
Again, I mean, these are the sort of the questions, right? And it's great that people are asking them. The political system is undoubtedly in need of some kind of attention, and some people be quite radical about what kind of attention that means. Our democracy is threatened by all sorts of things at the moment. But I think one thing to notice, in particular with this government, is that it is not actually that sort of ideologically driven. It's certainly not as ideologically driven as we might think. It kind of sways in the wind a bit according to what the public is seeking and demanding. So if we can reach people, and if we as people can reach them, government, through writing letters to politicians and that kind of thing, then we can start to influence them very quickly, even in their sort of current power, without sort of voting someone else in. So I think, and for me, the critical juncture on this is coming up in this country, which is COP26. COP sounds like some kind of South American football tournament. No one's heard of what this thing is. It's ridiculous. I've been working with the UN, and they have lots of things on their mind, and communicating this kind of stuff isn't necessarily one of them. But this is the opportunity, because this is when the world's governments come together and commit to things, and accelerate the action that they're taking part in. And I'm involved in a campaign called Race to Zero, which is really pushing that. And it's pushing it amongst businesses, cities, investors, and also the public. And that's going to start sort of appearing more. And there are lots of other campaigns like the TED Countdown thing, which are encouraging people to come together on this stuff, to see what's going on, to see what they can do, to recognize that there's a lot that they can do, and that a lot of that is about putting pressure on government. At the end of the day, we are the ones with the power. We give the power to them, those who are sort of in government or in business. And we sort of, when we recognize that, it's really kind of it opens up the road for us in a very powerful way.
Yeah, thanks, Paddy. And David has asked a question here. He's fortunate enough to have built a passive house, and it's been very satisfactory and satisfying and very economical. It was not expensive to do, but a small part, of all of it is build efficient houses. How can we encourage and persuade house builders to do so?
Keep telling that story. It's a really good story. I mean, this is it. Like, again, this stuff, it makes our lives better immediately if we do the right things. We can build better houses for ourselves, cheaper, that are easier to maintain, etc. But it takes people recognizing that's possible, and that takes people hearing the stories about it being possible. As I said, all this stuff, a lot of it is happening already out in the world, but we don't tend to sort of hear about it. So helping it to be heard is a really crucial thing. So I would suggest, find other people who've done this, get them together, find a way to invite other people into that, find a way to sort of make this something that people hear about. That's what I would suggest. Excellent,
thank you. And another former Galpin's boy, Peter, who's a geography and business studies teacher, would really like to know sort of, there's one book everyone should be reading that would really sort of bring this to life and give them a good understanding. What is that one book? What would you recommend?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I'm looking at my shelf. There's a lot, but I think The Future We Choose is a good one, because it really leans into the fact that we do ultimately have a choice here, because this is about designing systems, and system design is based on making decisions and choices. And there are lots of choices in the situation that are sort of false choices. Not everybody can make choices about the kind of things that they buy on the ground. That is a difficult reality. But we can all come together and decide what we think our world should look like and try and go after it. And that's the other critical thing, is really understanding what that world can look like, which that book does a pretty good job of. But there are many others. I would definitely just suggest that one first, I think.
And our housemaster in Galpin's house, geography teacher, Mr. Sanderson, he's looking behind those fantastic new couches in Galpin's, and he's trying to find that 23 billion. And when he finds it, sort of, what's the first thing we should spend that 23 billion on?
Well, it's actually 20, you mean the stuff down the back of the sofa, right? That's 26 trillion. So it's a lot of money. And well, we spend it on the various things that are in the list, from solar and wind and all the other things, and drawing down carbon. I mean, there are sort of very clear steps that are required here. The project drawdown is a really useful resource because it sort of maps it out really, really clearly. But yeah, it's 26.5 trillion that is sitting in what's called Moneyland. It has a name, which is the fictional place where those people hide their money. It's astonishing. So yeah, if we can find a way to access that, and I don't mean with pitchforks necessarily, but other ways, then we're into a pretty interesting place.
Fantastic. That was from, actually, to be fair to Mr. Samson, that was from all of Galpin's. Nigel's got a question. There's too much expectation of government to act first. What can individuals do themselves, and should they? I suppose you've almost answered some of those parts, but sort of what can their employers do? What more can employers do, I suppose?
Yeah, again, a great question. I mean, there are all sorts of initiatives that businesses can sign up to. Look at We Mean Business or the Race to Zero campaign, which is a sort of an umbrella campaign of all sorts of other things like science-based targets and business ambition for 1.5. And it's a thing that, Amazon and Ford and all those kind of companies are signed up to, Nike, Adidas. But the other thing is joining the various efforts that are also focused on nature, or becoming a B Corp. I mean, B Corp is a sort of interesting one. And there is actually a set of resources that I tend to send to businesses that I can ping around to those who would be interested in it. Maybe, Greg, I can send you that after this.
Yeah, look, that'd be great, Paddy. I mean, anything you think that would be really relevant, we can easily, what we can do is, if you send them through to myself, we can email it out to all those that are registered and watching the talk. So please do, that'd be great. Yeah,
brilliant. But yeah, basically to answer that question, is that there's a lot that you can do, and I think that the key thing as well is speaking to employees about this and understanding where they're coming from on it before they come to you.
Excellent. In fact, we've got our first virtual hand up, so I am going, Chris. If you just unmute yourself, you can ask Paddy your question, which would be great.
Hi, Paddy. Yeah, that's been really fantastic talk. Really wonderfully way you put it all together. I suppose the question I've got is about populism and the leaders you talked about, like Bolsonaro and Trump and other leaders like Putin as well. But with this sort of march of populism and the millions of people who seem to be able to be convinced by the false stories that you talked about, I'm just wondering how you remain optimistic despite that happening, and the fact that it's so, it's close to happening in several other countries as well. What do you think is going to turn that tide of populism that denies or doesn't want to think about climate change?
Yeah, it's a really important question. There's always a tension in transition moments between the future and the past, and that's what we're seeing basically with that going on, right? It's people sort of pulling, and I think the basic challenge here is that we are in an information war, to put it in a sort of quite grand sense, and it is difficult. There's no question about that, and fighting this stuff is hard. But I think the thing that will shine through is the stories about people's lives getting better as a result of this stuff. Donald Trump tells a story about coal and about improving, bringing back coal in the US. He doesn't tell people that in doing so, he will bring back automated coal, and that the people he's talking to, who he's telling them will have jobs, won't have jobs. So people will start to realize this stuff, and it won't take much actually in the end. But it is really difficult at the moment. There's no question about it, and it is a sort of a constant live struggle. And I think the thing that gives me hope is that I know that we know how to do this. And I know that when people see that and they recognize that their life can be healthier, more fulfilling, safer, etc., when these things start to happen, that they will veer towards that. Because ultimately, that kind of, I don't know if anyone's been reading Rutger Bregman's book, Humankind, fundamentally underneath, that is, we want to cooperate, we want to work together, we want to lead lives like that. And we will get through the things that are trying to stop us doing that at the moment. But no, it's one of the things that keeps me up at night, honestly. The information sort of war that we're in. It's a massive challenge.
Thank you very much for your question, Chris. Thank you. Okay, so Oleg's got quite a long question he's put into the Q&A, and to sort of paraphrase it, he's basically saying that sort of when he was looking at building a hotel, the costs were huge in order to put sort of Tesla batteries in, rather than necessarily the connection tenfold rather than connection onto Western Power, and effectively sort of what organisation is there, what incentives are there to help us to go green, because actually if you're trying to do a business, that's just not economically viable. So what would you recommend there?
Yeah, also a massive challenge. There is a great initiative just started by We Mean Business that is called, I think, the SME Hub. So I recommend looking at that because that provides an awful lot of support for people in your position. But no, this is one of the challenging things, that the way that we have organized our subsidies around this stuff is not in favor of the things happening. And that is changing in finance, the way people are sort of thinking about supporting. So I spent a bit of time in British Gas and Centrica, and they were thinking about how they can incentivize people to insulate their homes and buy the kinds of technology that are more efficient longer term, even though there's an upfront cost. They're finding a way to make that financially work for them. And that's a valiant effort. And I think that will start to happen. The cost of solar just keeps going down. There's an amazing graph, which is like, that goes like this. It's like the expectation of the industry of how the price of solar is going to go down, and it sort of flattens out like this, or the demand for it flattens out like this expectation, but it actually keeps going up and flattens out. And so it's kept going up like this, i.e. the demand for it, and therefore the reducing cost against the expectations of the industry at every level. So that's going to keep happening. So that situation you're in will be gradually getting better all the time. But yeah, in the meantime, I would suggest looking at the SME Hub, seeing if you can find anything in there that's helpful. And yeah, best of luck with it, because it's really tough, that.
Thanks, Paddy. And do you think we need to somehow streamline the countries all together, unify them more? How can we do that in order to make this considerable change? Or actually, is that the way forward, or is it more on a sort of a country by country basis?
Yeah, that is a great question in connection with the nationalism point. The sort of ideal scenario, I think, in terms of how the world is sort of organized in the future, is there's a kind of a network with nodes, basically. So there's a kind of overarching governance structure, but then basically most decision making is handled at quite a local level. And that's certainly a sort of scenario that a lot of people put a lot of time and effort into. Again, going back to the the information war side of things, that plays unfortunately into the hands of the narrative that the Green New Deal and any climate change action is somehow trying to create a new world order that will come in and create a global government that will control us all, which I don't think that's what's going on. But the kind of structure that is ideal maybe does sort of feel a little bit like that. So there's the challenge of trying to make that palatable to people. But again, that's really possible. One of my favorite examples of making something palatable to people is in the US, where the freedom dividend was introduced by Andrew Yang, one of the, I think is his name, sorry, one of the Democratic nominee people running for the position in the lead up to the election. He had took universal basic income, which is, as a concept, not very American, because it's universal, it's not very American. Basic, definitely not American. And income didn't feel like the right sort of language, because it sort of suggests something small compared to what you are getting as income. And he just changed it, called it the freedom dividend, which of course is American sounding. It's exactly what people want to hear. And it was immediately popular across the aisle. So everybody was suddenly supportive of that. So if you can find the right way to sort of shape and frame these things, to present them to people, then they can become attractive. And I would suggest that some kind of global government position or oversight is really desirable in this situation. But yeah, getting there is about how you package that up for people.
We've just got time for a couple more questions. I'm really sorry if we don't get to your question, but as a physics teacher and I currently teach my Shell class. My Shells, we're doing renewable, non-renewable energy resources. And it's great to see that the Galpins boys are asking another question. And which renewable energy do you think is the best one? And as population increases, should we aim to meet the demand for energy? Could it come straight from my Shells class? Go on.
Brilliant. Well, for me, it's got to be about solar, because fossil fuels are solar. They're just a sort of crap old technology for solar. And they're very intensive, of course, and very useful. But ultimately, if we harnessed all of the sun's rays that were landing on the planet for an hour, we would power the entire planet pretty much permanently. So the potential is there. Again, it's this abundance that we just haven't managed to sort of work out how to get yet. And part of that problem is because we think of energy as an industry. and really it should be about infrastructure. And when we start thinking about it like that with solar in mind, it starts to become a very different situation. So for me, yeah, solar is kind of the big answer. But at the moment, making the panels is problematic. And, you know, as I showed in that image, we don't need many of them, even at, I think, 20% capacity that they currently are, to be really useful. But it's then about getting them around the world, and it's about the minerals involved in making them and that kind of thing. But that, as I say, that is continuing to get better all the time. So yeah, I think for me, that's the answer. But the answer immediately is it's a blend of these things. And it will continue to be a blend of these things for a while. I spent some time talking to the big oil companies, and you know they're very set on doing this stuff, but they're going to keep gas in the mix for a while, and that is not going to go away probably, and that's going to have to be okay to some extent for the time being.
Yeah, and I just on a personal front, Paddy, I remember speaking to my uncle about who was involved with trying to lobby some key people in Australia about renewable and the renewable energy sources. And in Australia, you could go into a desert, and he would say to me, well, we could go into a desert where no one's habitable and put 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers of solar collectors, right? And you know, we wouldn't need anything else. But one of the key issues there, though, is the efficiencies of trying to move that energy across the country. Are you aware of how we improving those efficiencies to enable that sort of thing?
As I understand it, but again, it's also about this sort of, you know, we think of energy in a very centralized way, and, you know, increasingly it won't be, and that'll be part of the solution. It's sort of more localized, microgrid based, that kind of thing. But yeah, no, moving electrons around is expensive, basically, and it's difficult to do that, and for the time being, too expensive, arguably, to sort of go for that big energy as infrastructure play immediately. But I mean, hopefully long term. And I'm not a sort of an engineer. I'm not an expert on this really, but from what I understand of it, from the conversations I do have with people who do understand this stuff, then yeah, there is a very interesting direction of travel there. Yeah. But it does come down to that sort of more localized. And of course, what we're looking at is a slight shift of power here, where it's the people now in the global south who have access to that energy. They're the ones holding the cards.
Excellent. Final, we'll have one more question. I apologise for quite the number we haven't quite got. And Sue asks, what changes have the businesses you have worked with made to improve their carbon footprint? And you know, what have you done? Just sort of final one on that.
Well, lots of things. The business I've worked with. I mean, the campaign, again, the Race to Zero, has some pretty stringent criteria involved in it for people to sign up to. I mean, there's some really impressive stuff that people like Microsoft are doing, where they're planning to sort of make their carbon footprint negative since forever. So sort of back to when they started operating, and Google, I think, have followed suit. So there's some really interesting, powerful steps that people are taking. On a personal level, I am vegan, although I sometimes have a dairy day because giving up butter is hard. And I like croissants. I don't fly really at all anymore, which is, I mean, it was a really difficult thing for my industry, marketing, branding. So much of what people love about that industry is getting to fly places to do pitches or, meet clients or whatever. And so it's a real sacrifice for people to give that up, and it's really difficult for them. But ultimately, it is something that we have to do, and COVID has sort of forced it a little bit. What else do I do? All the kind of usual sort of recycling-y stuff. But then, all the work I'm doing in all the jobs I do is all geared around this. I certainly buy a lot less. My wife works in fashion, and she didn't buy anything for a year, any clothing for a year, and it completely transformed her life. She left her job. She now works in sustainability. She's much happier than she's ever been. It radically improved her mental health, giving up the sort of addiction to clothing she had. So yeah, you can feel a lot better, really quickly by doing these kind of things.
Look, Paddy, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for an enormously informative, inspiring talk. It made us think of the longer term, think about the importance of our climate, the importance of looking after our planet, the importance of looking after ourselves, ultimately, is what you're talking about. And you've given so many hints and ideas for what we can do to obviously make our planet a better place. Thank you so much for everybody attending tonight, both within the King's community and those out, because I do know we have quite a lot of people watching from all over the world tonight. So thank you so much for joining us. And Paddy, once again, thank you so much for your time. It's very kind and very much appreciated.
It's a total honor. Thank you all. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everyone. Really very much. Thank you for listening.
And
good luck.
Thank you very much, Paddy. And just finally, you talk about fashion and your wife. Our next King's Talk, just for something completely different, is on Wednesday, the 4th of November, and is an ex-Broughton girl, Peril. And she's a former Vogue stylist and Tatler editor who's also who's leading her own fashion brand, I believe. And we'll get a title soon, but it will be another different style of talk than what we have tonight and the one we also had a couple of weeks ago. So finally, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Paddy, and everybody. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye.